Hi, everyone, and welcome to another podcast where we discuss organization design and workforce planning with my favorite co-host, Shradha. How are you doing?
I'm doing great, Rupert. Thank you. Thank you for having me as always. And not having me, actually, what am I saying?
Well,
I'm
I'm not having
co-hosting
you.
this.
Thank you for having me. We're co-hosts here. This is a partnership
Exactly.
of the two of us.
Yes.
Unpacking Organizations, the Practitioners Podcast. Sponsored by Orgvue.
So, Rupert, it's always a pleasure to chat with you and connect with you. And I hope you are doing great. I'm doing great
I'm
here
doing
in
great. As
Northeast.
they say, always a pleasure, never a chore. Every day is a learning day, and every day
Fantastic.
is a chance for us to learn from someone with a lot of experience.
That is fantastic. That is fantastic. So now, today, we are all the more excited to be together because we have a guest with us. And Hardeep Kaur, welcome to our show, to our this episode of podcast Unpacking Organizations. And we are so excited to have you here. You have a fantastic experience from, you currently work in Merck, and you have a fantastic, amazing career around change and organization transformation. But we will be talking not just about what you have done in the organization, but how you have evolved as a leader and what are the learnings that you have gained over the years. So we would like to keep it at your level and your leadership level and your expertise level, not delving into the confidentialities of the war stories that you have gone through. So, welcome to the show, and we would love to know more about you from you, that who you are, what you have done, and what got you excited into this amazing world of change and organization effectiveness.
Well, thank you, Shradha, and thank you, Rupert, for the wonderful opportunity. I always find it very exciting and interesting to share my stories because I think our careers are so much more than just work, right? So, how our experience shape us and how, where we are actually born and raised and where we actually work is such a part of it. It's a holistic experience. So, yeah, I'll start a little bit introducing myself. So, my name is Hardeep Kaur. So I work at Merck, a large pharmaceutical company located in the East Coast, and obviously we're a global. We have global presence. But I started my career at Merck in the manufacturing space, which in the operations, and I always treasure that experience because I thought that not only helped me shape as a person, as a leader, but also my career as well. So if you know about manufacturing, particularly in the pharma space, and I was involved in manufacturing of vaccines. And when I say manufacturing, it was, from start to finish, right? So the whole end to end process. But through that experience, I learned some of the basic leadership skills. Like I learned, compassion, empathy, how to work with people, collaboration, understanding each other, like all the basic stuff that actually gives birth to great leadership, right? So that was sort of my starting point. But then also teaches you attributes to be a great leader, like in terms of tenacity, resilience, risk taking, decision making, all of those things. So I had a great sort of, I would say, if I sort of take my career, I can actually dissect into three parts. That was the first part, and I call that shaping, right? That's really shaped my thinking, shaped who I am, to the next part of my career, which was really into business. So that's where I learned change, or I got passionate about change. I spent some time in learning and development. I did some innovation work there as well. I led the learning and development organization, and I was, sort of getting into business strategy, business transformation. And then the third part of my career was not directly involved in actually being part of transformation and leading transformation. So, just a little bit about myself. And on the personal note, I was actually born and brought up in India in a small town close to Calcutta. And I studied in England. So, Rupert, I understand when you talk about weather and no sun, I get it. So I was there for about 7 years. I finished my university there, and then I moved to,
Whereabouts in the UK did you study, Hardeep?
I was in University of Westminster. Yeah, yep,
Nice.
yep. And one thing I will say, drawing from personal experiences, living in three different continents has really helped me appreciate the importance of cultural differences and nuances that comes with change and transformation. So I feel like my personal experiences and my professional experiences have really morphed very well into what I'm doing, and I'm extremely passionate about transformation and change. Hopefully that
Amazing.
give you a little bit of a
That's
color of my kid.
That's
so from small town India
Yeah,
to big town London
yeah,
to even bigger town, I guess in the around the New York metropolitan area.
yeah.
And when you did the manufacturing, was that in North America as well, or have you
Yes,
moved around?
yes, yes. The largest manufacturing plant is here in the Northeast region, so that's where I was. Yeah.
so Hardeep, as you're thinking about from shift from manufacturing into change, what
Hmm.
started that and what excited you most about that starting your career in change, which is much different from, well, not much different because manufacturing also has so much of these process improvement and process re-engineering and always quality controls. But what was the difference that you saw which got you more excited about this part of the world, um, which is
Sure.
change?
Yeah, and that's a journey in itself, right? So, when you're working in manufacturing, a couple of things are very important: cost and efficiencies, right? You want to bring the cost down, and you want to actually be very efficient. And the second thing that comes into factor is really the compliance sort of atmosphere or environment. So, working in a very regulated industry, every time we had to install change, it had to be done the right way, right? Because it's very regulated. So the discipline of compliance, and then just the sort of the passion of just how can we make our processes better? How can we simplify our lives, right? How can we, do more with less? All those things were just part of our DNA and part of our daily conversation. So those two, I would say organically, they started to shape up and intertwined. And then obviously, I was introduced to the discipline of change, right? So when I first started, we were starting to follow Connor. So Daryl Connor um, he has a four-step methodology for change, and we were all trained in that. So I think that's another, I feel very fortunate that I've had many, many experiences where I could professionally develop, which then it takes your passion into something more codified, right? So
And so,
yeah.
probably a lot of our listeners don't know the methodology. So, could you perhaps just
Yeah.
describe the four steps and why it works, and maybe that'd be helpful.
Yeah, sure. So Connor talks about decide, define, implement, sustain, which is in sync with project management, right? So what happens when you're ever installing change, you have to do it for a reason, right? You're not just going to change something for the sake of changing. So there has to be a very strong driver of that change. So as we are partnering with project managers, right, as they're on their journey for technical installation of something, right, we need to be on the people journey together, right? So I think his methodology was very sound, and then obviously backed up with how humans go through the change process as well, right? But that was the closest I think we could find, which was in sync with how projects are installed in any type of manufacturing space, particularly during that time. So that's where we sort of all sort of flocked towards that, and a bunch of us were trained in that methodology, and we started to use it. So, Shraddha, back to your question, how did this all come about? Obviously, the environment, the requirements, and then that's where my passion started to learn more about the art and science of change, right? So, one is about the process, but the other one is like, how do you actually, take all of that and do that in a skillful manner when you can actually drive the change? Because it's about people, right? So, you have to have the art and the science. So that's really what my passion, to for change started.
What was one of the toughest thing that you had to uh, build a muscle on as you were like diving deep into it and driving big large changes into the organization? Because many a times what happens is our practitioners are exposed to the change and they don't know how they need to flex and build a different kind of a muscle. So what is that like, as you're talking about the art of the change, what are some of the muscles that you build because it started getting hard and you had to shift your thinking?
Great question. I think the first thing that would come to my mind is this relentless curiosity, right? And it's interesting because you work in the same environment, you work in probably the same area, same department, or same business unit, and a lot of people make this assumption that you should know my problems, right? Like you're here, like why don't you understand what I'm going through? And I think for me, it's reframing it. Like I'm here to validate. I'm not going to make an assumption because your problems are really just centered around what's happening within your organization or your teams. So my job is constantly revalidating that. And in order to make sure I'm listening and I'm hearing and I'm really connecting, because that's all important and part of driving change, I had to be extremely curious with no biases, no assumptions, and really learn how to listen, right? Not only just listen at the surface level, not to hear, but to also understand the problem. So that was a personal journey I had to go through.
So I do practically and
Yeah.
from a tool perspective. So how do you go about listening and
Yeah.
documenting and capturing what you've listened and then playing back to show that you've listened? So what's your process and sort of down to the practical level of how you do that?
Yeah. So I follow a technique called appreciative inquiry. So there's a it's a tool you can use, right? Not a tool, but I think it gives you some framework. And it really gets into, again, I think the things I just sort of rattled off, right? Like making sure you're not going in there with preconceived notions or some sort of biases, right? You're going in there to really understand the problem, and that requires active listening, right? Really, seeking and then going back and clarifying, right? So this is what I heard. Is this what you meant? This is what I heard. Is this what you meant? So doing that multiple times helps in two aspects. One, it helps you build that robust relationship you're looking for to drive that change, and then also like validating that whatever problem you're trying to solve is the right problem and you're aligning around that, right? So you're not necessarily going to, I feel like, not going to rework, right? Because you understood the wrong problem means wrong solution, right? So that's how I kind of see that. Rupert, did that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. I guess even to double click on it.
Mm,
Um, so, and that's a very nice tool. So this is what I heard. So playing back, and this is what it meant. Did I interpret that? So that constant validation. Um, do you go through and write up interview notes? Do you, how do you summarize it? How do you, so there's
yeah.
in the conversation, but I can imagine you having multiple different interviews and how you synthesize and play back. That might be helpful for our listeners to kind of, yeah.
Yeah, no, definitely. Again, I've involved in my transformation journey, right? I have to speak to multiple leaders, right? And each one will bring their own perspective in. So I think what becomes really important is, maybe a couple of key points from each one of them, right? And then when you bring it all together, it doesn't have to be this huge thesis because no one has time. So that's something I've learned. Like if I write all these notes in like, Word documents or PowerPoint, whatever that may look like, they may not have time. So I've also learned the art of communication with these leaders. Like they want it like short, precise, and then actionable items, right? So you have to make it extremely smart. So for me, it is really just understanding, validating, and then getting to the crux of the matter versus just sort of skirting around with these long notes because they don't have time. So that's something I
Yeah,
practice.
there's a famous saying, and it's unclear who came up with it. Some people give credit to Churchill, others to Cates, others to a French philosopher whose name I've forgotten, but it goes something like, I didn't have time to write a short letter, so I wrote a long one.
Yes.
And so that's what you're really saying is what is the there's a process
Yes.
of gathering all this information from people and making sure you've got the right information, but synthesizing it in such a way that you've got to the crux, and then sense checking that.
Yeah.
So that's an editorial process, really. How do you go about that? Do you do that on your own? Do you do it with the team? Do you do it with somebody? Just double click on that.
Yeah, sure. I mean, sometimes it's alone, right? And sometimes it's with the team, depending on the initiative. But I follow a sort of this methodology of 30, right? 3:30 and then 3:30. So what does that mean, right? So if like somebody gave me 3 hours, and I loved your analogy, Rupert, if somebody gives you 3 hours to speak, you can go on and on, right? It's just great. Like you have 3 hours so you can, go deep, go broad, and really fill that time. If somebody told you, hey, you only have 30 minutes, it's harder, right? Because now you have to really pull out the essence of the conversation. If somebody said you only have 30 seconds, it's even harder, right? And I think for messaging, particularly when you're working in the change leadership space, all those three messages are important, because sometimes you have to influence and you need all the facts. So your 3 hours or your 30 minutes message has to be extremely clear, along with your 30 minutes, and then obviously your 30 seconds, because sometimes you will run some leader into an elevator, right? Like, what do you say? What's your elevator pitch? So for change and transformation, you need all of those pieces. You just have to be smart. What is important? What goes where? And then how do you use the right type of information to influence?
That's fantastic. I think it leads me to a different tangent now. Is that how you do the change versus how you now start cascading the change in the organization? How do you actually ensure that the change is scaled up as well as sticking on? So how what are some of the techniques, because you are so much getting into the practicalities of it, and our I'm sure listeners would be lapping all of it up. So what are some of your go-to frameworks, approaches, thoughts around cascading the change, scaling it up, because that's where the rubber really meets the road
Mhm.
and all the challenges happen. So from your experience, what do you think about that part?
Yeah, sure. And that's a great question, because for the amount of changes that I've installed from small, which is changing a short procedure, right? That's simply that compared to transformation. And I think today on LinkedIn I actually posted something about that, right? The difference between change and transformation. So the example I give people is like if a snake is shedding its skin and going through metamorphosis, right? It's just change. But if a larva is becoming a butterfly, that's transformation. You have completely, a different way of doing something, right? So going back to the practical things that I look at, the first one I think about is sponsorship. And I say this all the time, right? I will not work harder than my sponsor. So in the change space, right, I'm very clear. Like the sponsor has to set the direction, the sponsor has to remove the obstacles. They have to create that. I almost kind of think about like a machete. They have to kind of clear the playground for you to play in. So my first, sort of relationship building is really with the sponsors, and the second come the stakeholders. So understanding, and clearly getting into like a sponsor's head by asking the right questions, by using appreciative inquiry, it paves the path for the change, because I have to support the sponsor in making sure the change is delivered. And then clearly the next round of collation is around the stakeholders, because the stakeholders are the one who are actually going to help you, deploy that change. So those two cast of characters are really important. And then obviously, as you start to think about scalability, you need your change agents, you need your change advocates, you need early adopters, and we call them change champions. So there is a whole bunch of roles which are then specially carved out to actually deploy the changes depending on the scales. If it's a small, you would have fewer. If it's a large, you would obviously pick a large number. The right attributes of these individuals are very important, and we talk about that, right? Like you don't want to change champion who's just I won't say miserable, but like not necessarily bought into the change, right? You want somebody who can passionately talk about it and can see the good and the benefits. And so,
And Hardeep, with that, um, the one thing that's constant is change.
mhm,
And so, people talk about change all the time, change. And so with that, people get jaded. It's
mhm,
tiring,
mhm.
it's constant, and people have only got so much
Yeah.
emotion. Um, and there's just this natural resistance at a certain point. So how do you deal with that? What are some tricks that you've got that you can help us all deal with the inevitable change fatigue?
Yeah. I don't have the answer, but I can tell you like things that I've done, right?
Oh,
Because
Hadib, I
it is
thought you would have. I would have. Oh.
no,
You
seriously.
will you will help us crack that code.
Well, there are a couple of things, right? So I think, we get into this, change fatigue. So first of all, I think it's the shift in mindset, right? Is it really? Because to me, it's if you have a process in place or if you have any sort of like, thing you're trying to install, you want to make it better, right? Like, I mean, I come with the philosophy of like, I want to touch something and I want to leave it in a better state than I actually touched. So I think labeling it as like, oh my God, this is a change. I think some of it's actually just us, right? Just creating this whole thing of I don't know what the right word is, like fatigue in our heads. But to me, that's how you work.
Sorry to cut across, but are you actually saying it's not frame it as change because
Yeah,
it's just work. It's what we do.
Yeah.
So calling it
And it's
out as change,
constant.
it's constant. So let's not call it change.
Yeah.
Let's call it how
yeah.
we work. We make things better. Is that
New ways of working, right? And I have actually experimented with that in a couple of recent changes. And I'm like, why do I change the narrative around it? Because I think, listen, I mean, our brain is extremely primitive. Like, I mean, we think we've evolved, but I think like our brain is how many thousands, millions of years old, right? I don't think so. Our brain has changed. So we still fear that sense of loss when something is changing. I mean, why do people resist? First, they don't have the answers or the path to get to the future state, right? So that's they're looking. Then there's the biggest one is fear of loss, fear of control. So if we minimize that by just saying it's okay, you have a lot more control, be part of it, right? And changing the narrative towards that, I think it helps me personally. And that's what I tell my teams as we start to install changes. It's how we work. Now, transformation, huge changes are totally different beast. Now, they require a lot of, I would say, love, care, right? A little bit of methodology, process, listen to people. They're complex, and that's why they are transformational changes. They require very deliberate actions.
So what I'm hearing, Hardeep, is that there's an incremental change that is part of our life, and
Yeah.
that is how we work. It otherwise, if we don't do that, things will continue to get stale and old, and that's not how we should be there. That's not how we grow. But then there is a transformation which
Mhm.
is like very limited. It happens once in a while,
Mhm.
and that's why if we can make the difference between the two,
Mhm.
we will not have that mental burnout about it.
Mhm.
We will say that, okay, we're just changing, we're not transforming yet.
Yeah.
That's fantastic. I think that gave me a lot of thoughts. I'm going to use that. Thank you, Hardeep.
You're welcome.
So, Rupert, at the start of this session, when we were riffing, you had another question for Hardeep, which I'm now missing out on. You had incremental change, and then
yeah?
there was one more.
So it was one really differentiating, but I think we've addressed that between incremental, constant change and big transformation. And just I mean just to paraphrase, but it would to show that I understood correctly and do I get the meaning right? Uh, Showing that I'm learning from you, Hadid. At least I'm trying. So what I'm seeing is that the incremental is it's constant. It's just the way of working every day, and then the transformation is a fundamental shift in something for a big strategic reason. So it's linked to strategy and a change in strategy. So it might be entering a new market or a new service line, a new way of, another go to market. So that, big significant change, which often with org design, we actually in my book, I refer to macro design.
Mm.
And macro design is changing the operating model.
Mm-hmm.
And that, sometimes I call that heart surgery, right? It's like you're radically changing something and you're taking the heart out and putting another heart in and really changing the whole animal, as it were. Whereas and too often people go to that when you don't need to. Because it makes you feel powerful and big and it's dramatic. And often in micro design, the detailed design, that's where you've got how the work happens at the detail, and often you can just solve things with that. And sort of a hypothesis. I think too often people are going for the big transformation because it's like often leaders go for M&A, like let's go and acquire a company. It's like
Yeah.
I've forgotten what to do, and 80% of M&A fails, 80% of transformation fails, and so they do that when actually the answer might be just in 100 things that you can do better, and you add all those 100 things up, and you actually made the whole system far more effective. I wonder if that's your experience as well.
Yeah, no, I think that is accurate, right? Oftentimes the answer is just within the organization, right? But I think we seek for bigger, and part of it is, to be very honest, some of it's satisfaction of the ego. I want to leave a mark, and so I want to do something, bigger and different. But how different is it? Like, if you're not changing the business system around it, it's not necessarily transformation. It is just changes, and maybe like even changes could be small, medium, large, right? And I think that's why we love Connor's methodology, because he talks about how do you approach a smaller change and a medium change, in terms of medium impact and then larger impact. And I can tell you, like, if we look at our history, so AI's disruption, right, that's transformational, right? So an iPhone, every time we get an update, that's just a change. It's not a transformation at all. So it's just simple examples that, stop making it bigger than it is. Oftentimes, when I get in front of talking about changes, I always start with the position of, you already doing this. Like, you do this on a daily basis. All we are going to do is shift a little bit so to make it better and beneficial, right? So I think folks then calm down, because that whole anxiety of the fear of loss, right? You're not listening at that point. You're in this whole defense mode. And some of that causes the reactions of the parasympathetic part of the brain, and then you're just sort of reacting, and then just leads to one thing to the other. So it's just positioning, and I think that's where your sponsors are extremely helpful. Framing, positioning, the change, where is it connected to, it's very, very helpful.
Yeah. Actually thinking about the loss, and positioning it as a gain. So a tool that I learned was the whiffum and the whammy. I'm not
Yeah.
sure if what's in it for me and why is this against my interest. And the whammy, the why is it against my interest, is a far more powerful emotion.
Yes.
It
Yeah.
was the loss is a far more powerful emotion. It's what makes people risk averse than the
Yeah.
whiff and what's in it for me. But trying to shift that, so you're already doing this already. You already know this, and making it smaller. You're taking away that possible perception of loss, and then positioning. These are all the upside. This is what it's going to mean, and getting this. I guess the sponsor in the 30 seconds, probably 15 seconds of your 30 seconds has to get to negating the
Yeah.
whammy and getting the what's in it for me kind of nailed organizationally, and then to the individual.
Yeah. And I think you bring up a good point. I think it's a balance of both, right? So sometimes you have to, position that as an opportunity. Sometimes you have to position that, we call it burning platform, right? It has to be the right balance, because if you just go in one side, and then there is this whole assumption of like, "Yeah, here we go again, like that spiel, or we talk about that flavor of the month. So it's a delicate balance. And I feel like, and I think that's really where I advise leaders as well. Like, which one are you feeling comfortable, and which one's going to drive that change for you? Is it that whole, we call it FOBO, right? Fear of being obsolete, or is it you want to position that as an opportunity? That positioning becomes really important. Doing more of one is also dangerous, right? Because people get like tune out. They're like, okay, here we go again, right?
And is the here we go again mindset also being incomplete finishes? Like people love
Absolutely.
kicking things off. Here's a new, and actually, and defining the finish line. We have this thing in software development, like done, done, done. Like, how do you define done? Because you've built it so functionally it works. Well, that's the developers say it's done. The
Yeah.
code's written and it works. Is that done? QA to the point where end users can use it. You
Yeah.
can say, well, now they can use it, so that's done. So that's done. But actually, done is it's actually out there with all the training, with all the positioning, and people are using it on an ongoing basis, and it's been refined to the point where people don't see it anymore. And I think all too often, and I'm as guilty as this as the next person by some margin. It's actually been clear about what done is, and not declaring success along the way, but not declaring success too early. And we always love the shiny, and it's a note to self, but I think this is where we fall short a lot of the time, and that's where the fatigue comes in, because here we go again.
Yeah.
It's like, we're going to do something, I'm going to put all my energy into it, and then from sizzle to fizzle, kind of thing. So I guess you're nodding a lot and smiling, so I'm
Yeah. And I think you bring up a good point, and I'll take it to even step further, right? Where has it created business impact and impacted your bottom line, right? So to me, it's actually in four stages, and I agree with you. And the key to all of that to me is like your stakeholders, because each of your stakeholders is going to have a vested level of interest in each one of those elements. So if you did a good job of really mapping out your stakeholders and understanding their needs, you can actually get to that stage four, where the first is just installation. The second is like, are people using it, right? Which we call adoption. And then secondly, has it really started to cause a business impact?
Yeah.
Like that, the realization that we actually anticipated in the beginning of it. So
no.
Absolutely. And Ardeep, this brings me to a point that what do you feel excited about this space as we are moving forward in this new era? There's so much of technology that is starting to help us or hinder us, right? Because there is a lot of more fear and holding on to the ground. So what excites you a lot as we move forward?
it's a great question, and I was hoping you would ask that, right? So I think part of my excitement is there's so many opportunities in the art and the science component of it, right? Because every single person, all of us are going through changes. Like literally, just on a daily basis, I want to learn something new about AI. Like, how is it going to help me? How is it going to improve the quality of my life? So some of it is actually personality. I'm usually a very positive person, so I like to see the glass half full versus empty. So personal, I think some of the personal attributes actually does contribute to that. But in general, I feel like we need to. This is not going away. So first of all, let's just get that right. This is not going to go away. It's here to stay. So might as well jump and start early experimentation. Like think about how can we start to experiment, particularly in our day-to-day lives, and then start to think about how is this going to happen at work as well, right? Because it's not, the technology is not going away. In fact, the pace is so much faster. Like whatever it took us to, I think, do like in like a year, we can actually do that in 30 days, if or even less. I think I was reading a stat somewhere, and it's just amazing at the pace we can't keep up with. But so running away from that's not going to be an option. Diving in is an option. And what excites me more is the opportunities that exist, right, for folks to focus on, the people, the human side of the change. I call it, make it human centric. But I also want to like, how do you sort of start to make that connections to hearts and minds, which will drive that change? So technology is great, right? I mean, I use ChatGPT all the time, to get my blank page syndrome out, right? Because sometimes you just, you don't know where to start. So I absolutely use that. But what I think is important is the humanistic component of it, really the expertise, the creativity, the innovation that is going to happen. So I'm just really excited for us for the future. I just hope we use all of this responsibly. That's
Mhm.
all.
Nice.
Absolutely.
So we've talked about a lot of tools actually, and traps. So to summarize in 30 seconds or less, not quite. You don't have to do that, but a cool one tool. If you the listeners take away one tool that you think would have the biggest impact on them, and one trap that's so easy to fall into, what would they be?
Yeah. I always say progress is better than perfection. So that's something that it's like on my table, my mantra, right? I just kind of click, I'm like, yes, I'm shooting for progress, right? So to me, that sits very well with incremental. Like we cannot be shooting for perfection all the time. Dive in, take risks and start, right? You got to start somewhere to get to, where you need to be. So progress is better than perfection is something I say to myself. The other one is just analysis paralysis, right? So I think in this whole era where we have to constantly think about what is going to look different, like stop doing analysis paralysis and take some risks and dive in. And I think that to me, those two things, right? I don't know if they're tools, but I think more mindset. And I feel tools are great, but if your mindset is not where it needs to be, tools don't work, right? So more of a how do I think about things differently, and I use those as tools for creating discipline for myself, and then obviously sharing that with others.
That's
Nice.
a great point. Like the mindset can also be a tool or could be a
Yep.
trap.
Yeah, it could be a trap, right?
Yeah, probably is a
That
trap a
is
lot of the
fantastic.
time.
Exactly. I think we are our worst enemies, right?
Yeah,
So, I recently, not recently, but I think for me, what the shift I started to see in myself, right, is really this how it's just my approach to problems, my approach to anything that was in front of me. So I felt like the inward journey as a leader was far more important than the external journey. So being self-aware. So I recently actually completed women's leadership course. It was a Yale executive course, but the whole course was sort of pivoted around the women leadership. And what they were talking about is men, I think typically we associate some attributes of decision making, risk taking, and all those leadership skills with men, so masculine attributes. And then women, it's like this emotional awareness, and it's just very sort of soft. But moving forward, I think the right balance is important in any sort of business setting. In fact, I would say more of these qualities are important as AI is on rise, because empathizing with people, right? You're sort of sympathizing, that human connectivity, collaboration. So it's, to me, I think I'm always in this quest of how can I make myself better and my mindset better, which then obviously proliferates into my surroundings and my environment, make me a better leader and a better change leader too.
Yeah. Change starts with within, from within,
Yeah,
right? So
yeah.
that's beautiful. Well, thank you so much, Hardeep, for being here and sharing all your amazing journeys with us and stories with us and tools with us. And we wish you the best. And thank you so much for coming up and being great, being awesome.
Well, thank you, Shradha, and thank you, Rupert. And again, I recall meeting Rupert at the Miami Transformation Exchange Summit, right? And it was great. So I'm happy to be here, and thanks for the opportunity.
Shradha, great to see you again. Hardeep, thanks so much for all the pearls of wisdom. There's a lot to reflect on, and until next time, everyone.
Yeah,
Until
thank
next
you.
time, thank
Thank you
you.
very much. Bye bye.
Unpacking Organizations, the Practitioners Podcast. Sponsored by Orgvue.